Hi, this is Donovan. It's taken me a long time to get back to this, but I'm going to wrap up chapter 1 tonight and part 2 of Sex and Sacrament. This subsection, this last section of chapter 1 is called Service as Sacrament, Priesthood of All, and it's about ministry. So this work originally was intended as a sacramental theology for my students, who had been swindled out of bringing their bodies and senses into devotional life, as if only the disembodied mind and certain words could connect them with God's presence. In our church history and theology classes, I was the professor, I dig back into Thomas Aquinas' ways of explaining sacrament as healing medicine, as mystery, a sacred secret. Writing the first ever Christian systematic theology, Aquinas had laid the foundations for Christian understandings of sacrament ever since that time. And he wrote specifically at a time when Europe had 19,000 different isolation hospitals for victims of leprosy or plague. So he also lived in a time of plague. So I still think it's very relevant to look at what he had to say about experiencing God, the invisible God, in ways that we can meet God in our bodies such as they are in a time of plague. So writing it under those conditions, Aquinas described sacrament as a visible, tangible, material, in other words, made of matter, sign of an invisible medicine. He literally did use the term medicine, or healing, that makes the person who participates in it holy. And here we got to understand that holy, there's in English, it's a synonym, or is that the right word? Not synonym. Homophone. It sounds the same as holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y. Wow, it's been a long time. My youngest child will laugh at me for getting confused about that. But so anyway, holy with H-O-L-Y and holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y. Yeah, they're different words, but in fact, if we go back to the way that ancient people understood it in ancient Greek, in ancient Hebrew, but especially those like Aquinas who were influenced by ancient Greek and biblical concepts, the idea of perfection or holiness, it meant completeness. So a lot of times in this series, I've been talking about, the ancient and medieval understandings of sin were not about specific actions. They were about, are you going towards the fullness of all God wants you to be, or are you disintegrating away from that? A simpler way of talking about it, and it just came to me today, is completeness or incompleteness. So sin is really, incompleteness, and holiness is really completeness. We've got these really loaded words that have lots of baggage with them now, but that's really what they were trying to get to. So in some kind of way, the sacrament, participating in a sacrament is something that heals you, gives you good medicine. It helps you go from being incomplete to being complete by connecting you with God. So sacraments meaning transcends and embraces all of time. That's one of the things Aquinas pointed out, that somehow one of the mysteries or the great secrets that these little things like bread or wine or water embody is that they're connected to the past. The meaning that we attribute to them comes from something in the past that we value, and we experience them, and they're effective now with us here in the present moment. And they also, those who believe in them as sacramental, one thing that makes them sacramental is that we believe in some way it's pointing us towards a future hope, that it's what we're experiencing now of this connection with the divine is something that we'll continue to experience maybe in an even more complete way and an even more enduring, ongoing way in the future. So that's one thing that for Aquinas makes a sacrament is that somehow it embraces all of time in every dimension. So it's an experience of oneness. And again, here I think of, what I've been saying all along about union, yoga, oneness. All these things kind of come together. We see in many different streams of spiritual practice this goal of being one with the divine, whether it's contemplative Christian prayer or yoga practice, or even taking the sacraments and the original understandings of what those meant. So Christians today can only agree on 3 specific worship experiences experiences that they share as being sacramental: baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. So the two other sections of this chapter that episodes 25 and 26 were about baptism and Eucharist, respectively. This one's about ministry. So drawing on other streams of experience, faith, and spirit, this first chapter introduces these three sacramental experiences: baptism, Eucharist, ministry. But it also celebrates a wider range of ways that the divine and our human bodies mingle and meet in worship. So I'm talking about those three things in chapter 1. Henceforth, for the rest of part 2, we're going to be going into other areas that are not confined to Christian understandings of sacrament. But this is really sort of the launching pad, or the springboard, into all these different embodied ways that are also sacramental. And I'll explain it anyway. So I just wanted to start here to bring those who are Christian, perhaps if they're willing to explore this, along on the journey with us, meeting where folks are at. So in the Christian tradition, this third sacrament, ordination, was the one sacrament that was not for all Christians. Like, everybody who was Christian was supposed to get baptized at some point or another. If you were baptized, you would need to take communion, or you could take communion. That was open to everybody that was baptized. But ordination was kind of set apart in its liturgical form, liturgy being public work. It's the public ritual work that expresses the sacrament. Ordination is for those who commit to perform a specific role or office or ministry in the service of the whole faith community. So priests, bishops, deacons. This sacrament made the organization of this spiritual community possible. However, as I'm sure many of us are aware, political manipulations affected the practice of ordination. Even then, in Aquinas' time, I should add that, sorry. Political leaders and those with wealth provided fine lodgings and a good salary to favor those who had more influence in the church, like bishops, for example. And by doing that, the political leadership and the wealthy meddling in church leadership, we see, even in Aquinas' own time again, eruptions of systemic violence, like the church-sponsored military invasion and ransacking of the Middle East that is now known as the Crusades. Of course, all that's in Aquinas' times, and it continues in many, many forms even today. So that same church and state mutual meddling that erupts into systemic violence, we continue to see that right now. I cannot help but mention that on the night that I'm filming this, we are preparing in the U.S. for the debate between two vice presidential candidates, during what seems to be a rise of fascism in the United States, or at least an attempt in that direction. So this feels very. I can feel the weight of the corruption of sacraments by political and wealthy interests in a very vivid way right now. It does not seem purely medieval to me right now. And I want to go back to, so I want to kind of set that aside, that idea of a set apart special group of people that get to be ordained. That's the last I have to say about that. We can see that it was corrupted. We can see that it's corrupt now. Notwithstanding, some people have ordained ministries. I'm not trying to disrespect those who do that well, but I want to take this a different direction. The original sacred texts of Christianity speak of a priesthood of all believers, and that famously comes from 1 Peter 2, verses 5 through 9. This is an idea that's been embraced by many mystics, church reformers, and it's resonant with the understanding of service in other traditions. So in many traditions around the world, service is an expression of devotion. It's a spiritual path to oneness with the divine, a healing of true self into the fullness of what we can be. So it fits, service can fit the definition of even of the way that Aquinas defined sacrament. just service, and anybody can do service. For if we're doing service in a certain spirit out of devotion, um, it can be a path to oneness. So for those of us who've been cast out or excluded from ordained ministry in that narrower sense that we started with, this universal path of love of self for others and for God is open wide, beckoning and welcoming. So you love yourself and you express, you do love that self, and with that self, you love others and you love God in service. So this, again, it's wide open. So here's where when I was writing the first draft of this manuscript back in 2012, I was still an ordained minister in a historic Peace Church tradition, as I had been for 15 years by then. In that sense, I'd been an ordained minister first in the Mennonite Church and then in the Church of the Brethren. So for a total of 15 years, encompassing both those Peace churches. I was assigned to teaching ministry, like Aquinas, teaching and writing systematic Christian theology as a university professor. On sabbatical during a baffling digestive illness, bedridden and progressively weakening, day and night, I was reading classics of Christian spiritual autobiography, which have already permeated the episodes I've done. All these were written as conversations with God. I chose things that I thought students might be able to relate to, even though they were written hundreds of years ago, because they were written as personal conversations with God, as prayers. From Augustine, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Anselm of Canterbury, I've been quoting them all through this series. I almost feverishly took notes, feeling as if I were praying with those saints from what I then believed might be my deathbed. I was palpably feeling God's loving presence sustaining me in spite of not being able to hold down food or liquids for many months. I continued to take psychiatric medications and female hormones that had been prescribed for me for decades, apparently with no communication, it turns out, between the psychiatric team and the obstetric gynecological teams about my abnormalities and my resistance to the drugs that should have been helping. They should have worked, but they didn't. It wasn't, I took them as they were prescribed, but they didn't work. And nobody could figure out why, but I got sicker and sicker and sicker. So conflicted by feelings of loyalty to my Christian work community and deep conviction beyond any doubt that the ministry of the committed same-sex partners who led worship at my home church was sacrament, I wrestled with what God was telling me to write. The ministries of gay, lesbian, transgender, and bisexual people clearly bear good fruit, draw people to God, and serve both God and others in ways that bless the whole community. They are sacrament, even in the most conservative, Aquinian way of looking at sacrament. Even though it would surely mean the death of my own ministry and career, I also could not keep silent about that. As Jesus said, even the rocks and stones will cry out praising God. Yes, for the ministries of queer lives and loves too. That, I believe, I just felt this deep conviction. It's like, I can bite my tongue about this only so long, but the truth of this will erupt. The ministries of queer people, the marriages of queer people are good and they bear good fruit. And I wanted with all my being to testify to that. I was convinced that my situation was hopeless. God had tasked me, a sick and dying, physically frail person with decades of mental illness diagnosis. I'm going to put the diagnosis there, with the impossible task, it seemed, of proclaiming gay marriage as a sacrament in an increasingly hostile university and denomination. That's what I thought this book that was coming to me as I was jotting down all these notes, praying with Catherine and Teresa and Augustine. That's what kept coming up. In the past year, both the denomination and this university I was working at had drawn a line in the sand, refusing even to agree to disagree or even further discuss this matter. I was certain God could not use me because I was certain that I was dying and I was incapacitated. I also had been told for many decades at this point that I was mentally ill. So I was like, I have no credibility. And I was living as a woman in a community, both communities, the denomination and the university, were primarily communities where women were not thought to have equal teaching authority, especially on theological matters and spiritual matters with men. So I just knew that, you've given me this impossible message, and I'm not a person that anybody's going to listen to, and I'm probably going to die before I even get to, even if I do write this down, who's going to read it? With this growing conviction deepening over many bedridden, prayerful months, I had this dream. I was in a hospital bed, in the condition I was in real life at the time, skeletal, unable to stand for more than a few minutes, only half awake in the dream. I heard the patients in other beds around me moaning, crying, and the buzzing of their call buttons requesting help over and over again. And no one came. In my weakened state in the dream, I lay wondering why no one came to help. It seemed hours, maybe even days went by. No one came to check on us, and the cries intensified. People became sicker around me. I became righteously indignant, hot with anger. Finally, an authoritative woman in blue hospital scrubs and a clipboard came to my bed and introduced herself. She was clearly in charge. So angrily, I asked what had taken so long. Where was her staff to help these people? With closed lips and a piercing gaze into my eyes, she just locked on me and looked at me, like bored into me with her eyes. She kind of had this half smile. She told me, I've been calling them. I've been calling and calling. They're not picking up. In that moment, and I don't know why, it was a dream, okay, so it was dream logic. In that moment, I understood that this was God. And I was speechless even in the dream. I almost am now telling you. Understanding she knows. She knows we need help. And she's calling. She's calling and calling and calling for help. But we don't pick up. We don't even let it go to voicemail. Maybe we let it go to voicemail, but we don't answer the voice messages. Most people never pick up. That's what I got out of that dream. And as I absorbed this with dread and grief, in the dream, I was still in the hospital. I was still in this sick bed. She gently said, why don't you help them? Immediately, I protested, I'm sick too. I'm dying. Can't you see? And now this was resonant with what was happening in real life. I really thought my doctors were telling me, you're probably going to die. Like, you can't keep food anyway. I can't even get out of bed. Well, I barely can get out of bed. And she said, but you can get out of bed. You're not as sick as everyone else here. Some, yes. Sicker than some, much better than others. You can do something. You can do something. So do it. And without helping me, she looked back at her clipboard, she turned around and she left. As I got out of bed, I wandered toward where the screams seemed the loudest. And it turned out to be the hospital entry, where I now saw firefighters bursting in, breaking the glass entryway with axes, rushing to put out some fire somewhere. And there were small children in nightgowns with bare feet, huddled together in the lobby, trying to get away from the fire. And someone yelled, I still don't know who. Was a firefighter? Was it hospital staff at the front desk? Was it another patient? I don't know. Someone yelled at me to pick up the children and carry them out over the glass so they wouldn't cut their little bare feet. And as weak as I was, that I could do. I picked up one child and I realized I could do that. And I felt this relief wash over me. Thank God they didn't ask me to be a doctor. They didn't ask me to be a nurse. They didn't ask me to be a firefighter. I can't do any of those things, but I can do this. And I woke up. Obviously I still remember this dream. This something changed for me after that. And this, even though that was back in 2012, this is still, now we're in 2020. 8 years later, this is what service means to me now. In the months after that dream, my diagnosis changed. Doctors finally told me, after many decades of seeking help from them, that I didn't need to take psychiatric medications anymore. I just needed to live as a man. And not long after that, I stopped taking female hormones, which didn't seem to make sense for someone living as a man. My physical health started to improve and has remained excellent. And after a year, less than a year and a half of not taking those female hormones, other doctors told me that I had an intersex condition. In fact, I no longer see OBGYNs, I see a urologist. So it, yeah. In the meantime, that's not really the point of the story, but it was something. I'm now no longer confined to bed. In the meantime, my fears about being excluded from Christian teaching ministry did prove to be well founded. So for me to get out of that bed, stop taking all those medications that had kept me compliant and kept me in the narrow confines in which Christianity defined me, I did, in fact, have to stop working in ordained ministry. But so did the dream also prove to be well founded. So as I began to discover I was no longer employable as a university theology professor, I'm no longer following in Aquinas' footsteps, and that's okay. He supported the Crusades. I mean, he did not actively, but he definitely didn't do anything to cry out against them or disagree with them vocally. So I'm no longer following in his footsteps, no longer a university theology professor, but I did get to work as a part-time church custodian at the church where I preached my coming out sermon and had once helped with Christian education and children's ministries. So as I cleaned up dog droppings and branches from the tree lawn and sidewalk, I should say, it's tree lawns. Sorry, let me just circle back to that. So as I cleaned up dog droppings and branches from the tree lawns and the sidewalks where elderly worshipers would soon be walking precariously, this was very vivid to me at the time because I knew and loved these folks. I knew some folks came in on walkers, some people had canes, some people had wheelchairs. So I knew those things need to be cleaned up from where they were stepping. As I mopped vomit off the asphalt of the parking lot that our downtown church shared with several area bars and restaurants, where children would soon be entering the playground to frolic as their parents prayed. As I removed spider webs and sometimes found black widows and other pests from the benches where the elders would sit down to sip punch and catch up with family after the service. As I made sure restrooms were not only clean but were stocked with paper and soap, the necessary items in the restroom, I had more confidence then in my ministry of service than I ever had as a preacher or theology professor. It felt like what teachers of karma yoga had long taught me about Shiva. I still don't know how that was. It's a language I don't speak, so I'm not sure. I've read it and I've heard it, but I'm not retaining. Anyway, service we get to do in devotion to God without any particular reward. Now, I admit in this case, I did get a little bit of cash that helped with groceries. I was a single custodial parent of 2 minor children at that time, and I was very grateful to get that grocery money. But it wasn't the ministry I thought that I had dreamed of when I was getting my PhD or working on all those publications and conference presentations, national and international presentations, as I worked my way to full professor. I really thought I was set for life in a career. None of those things mattered anymore as I emptied the church nursery diaper pail or made the coffee. As a person queer in body and queer in love, the sacrament of ministry is not the same for me as it once was. I don't have access to the same sacraments some others do. So when I get to be of service, when I get to be part of humanity again, not as an object of pity or scorn or curiosity, that happened a lot after I came out, but as a regular person doing a regular job, I experienced that as a place beyond the pettiness of human bigotry and arrogance, where God's grace and I meet and embrace. And that's all I have to say about ministry.